You very much, Jane. And welcome, everybody. Welcome, sisters. Thank you for joining us this evening for a really, really important Let's Talk event. So, as you'll have heard in that introduction, we're going to be hearing from, thinking about, and discussing the Jo Cox Foundation Civility Commission recommendations. Now, I probably don't need to tell people on this call, but I will, because we should never numb ourselves from the reality of the context that we face, that the reason for that report, those recommendations, and this discussion this evening is that the amount of abuse, intimidation, and harassment that some members in public life, politicians, but others face, have certainly been on the rise in recent years. It's something that LWN takes very seriously. We hear a lot from our own membership about, and we don't think it's right, but we're not just here to talk about it. There are some practical recommendations to clean up politics for good. There are some brilliant women on the call who are going to tell us some more information to inform us all so that we can be informed and inspired to make politics that really inclusive place for everybody to be in. I'm just going to invite speakers this evening to tell us a bit about who they are and why this issue is important to them before we get stuck into those recommendations. So I'd like to first introduce Seema Malhotra, Minister in the Home Office and Equalities Minister, and long-standing friend and member of LWN. Seema.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and also Jane and all the LWN team. And look, I'm really pleased to be able to join tonight and to see so many women taking part, friends and sisters from across the country, and very proud that obviously one of my local councillors, Catherine Dunn, long-standing leader in LWN as well, is also on the call. I have had obviously a long history in politics in the Labour Party, and I think that the times that we are in are ones that we wouldn't have predicted, with hostility coming into our politics in so many different ways and so many different forms and through so many different routes in one day. And from the roles I've had, and now as a minister in the Home Office and in the Cabinet Office, what's clear is that we've got to take steps to make our democracy and our spaces of debate in public life free from fear, in the way that we've got the principles of the call tonight. Because what we're seeing is that far too many people are not feeling that they're able to participate without fear, and that is weakening our democratic institutions and the foundations of our democracy. So I'll just end with this point, which I'll come back to further in the discussions. But it is the reason why the Home Secretary has set up the Defending Democracy Task Force, which is chaired by the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis. And that is bringing together people from across government departments, as well as those who have been affected by intimidation and harassment in public life and in elections and in their roles in democracy. And that is to make sure that we can tackle the threats that we're seeing, and do that collectively, and do that with government leading from the top.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much. So already we've heard about that action. So I'll bring that more out in the call later. Looking forward to hear more about what's happened already. So next, I'd like to invite Anya to tell us a bit about herself, the roles that she has, and why this topic is important to you, Anya.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real privilege and such a key topic. And I guess I'm coming here tonight with two hats on. And the first is definitely my working hat. So I'm a councillor in Hackney. I'm vice chair of the Fabian Women's Network, and I'm the democracy lead for Compassion in Politics. So this is a really key topic in all of those areas. areas. And day to day, whether I'm on the doorstep or whether we're working in Parliament with parliamentarians at the coalface of these issues, I can see a rise in the problems around this. And I really am feeling that we are at a watershed moment. And just as the Jo Cox Civility came out of a dreadful event with the murder of Jo Cox, I feel that we're also at another watershed moment at the moment where politics could go one of two ways. And we're seeing a rise of the far right, we're seeing a rise of sort of simplistic solutions, but we're also seeing a pushback from spaces like this and from progressive politicians looking to find an alternative narrative around politics. So I guess I'm speaking from a work hat, but also from a personal hat, that this is something that I care passionately about as a woman and as someone who's worked in this space for a long time, and who's been at the receiving ends of abuse and threats and intimidation. I know just how important this issue is. So I'm hoping that tonight, collectively, we can come up with some solutions and some ideas about ways forward, because it really is vital. And I look forward to being part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Anya. I have to say that passion is certainly coming through. Saj, can I invite you now, please, to talk about your positions, what your interest in the topic, what you're going to bring to the conversation this evening.
Yes, thanks, Kieran, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here in this wonderfully sisterly group, and I always love joining Labour Women's Network's calls and events. It's always such a great space to find myself in. Sadly, we're not talking about a subject that we necessarily want to be in politics to be discussing, but it's really important and vital that we are heard and that people do understand how much this impacts our work as politicians, women's work as politicians, and the work of women of colour as politicians as well. So my name is Saj Ahmad. I am a councillor in Nottingham City, and I also stood in the general election in 2024 in Newark in Nottinghamshire. And I always like to say this everywhere I go, because I always get a round of applause, or the equivalent that we do on Zoom calls. I stood against Robert Jenrick, reducing his majority from 23,000 to just over 3,000. Thank you very much. I'm still milking that for all it's worth, so hope you don't mind me doing that. But yeah, so I guess one of the things I'm quite keen to talk about was I'm generally quite keen to talk about my experiences as a councillor, and you know that the impact that it's had on me in terms of the difficult sort of the hostility that I faced as a councillor, but then also more so, it was stepped up significantly when I even just announced my interest in standing as a general election candidate in Newark. And I think it's really important to think about the impact on women, but also how actually women of colour face a different kind of abuse, a different level of abuse sometimes as well. And we all know that Diane Abbott is one of the most, I think, the most attacked people on social media. And so it's really important to understand the very real impact it has on all of us. And I guess I agree with Anya in that I'm concerned that we're actually moving backwards almost in this space, that we're actually moving to a space where we're less and less inclined to be civil towards each other. And I'll come on to that with when I go through my experiences. But, you know, we've all seen over the last few weeks and months Elon Musk and various others behaving in a completely hostile way towards people in politics. And it almost seems that we're saying that there's a group of people out there who seem to think that is okay. And when we lose that cross-party support on an issue like this, that's a real concern to me. So I hope that we can talk a bit more about that. And as Anya says, talk about solutions and talk about ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You set that up very well for us, Saj, when talking about finding solutions, because that's exactly what Hannah, I'm sure, is going to talk through in a moment. But before we get to that, I would just like to thank the panellists who have and do represent Labour at lots of different levels. Thank you very much. We're very grateful. We know what it takes. We know the unintended consequences sometimes of being a woman in public life. And I think sometimes it's very easy for us to glide by and just think that it's a part of what you do. It shouldn't be. And thank you for doing it. And thanks in advance, Saj, because I know you're going to talk about some of your personal experiences, which aren't going to be pleasant, I'm guessing, but we're using that as a call to action to make sure that we can bring about that change that many of us on this call want. So thanks in advance for that. Right, it's left to hand over to Hannah then, our final panellists. So Hannah, could you introduce yourself, please, and let us know why this topic is important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for being here and for putting on this event. As everyone has talked about, is a really important issue. And as we were developing the Jo Cox Civility Commission and as we are kind of rolling it out, Labour Women's Network really has been a champion of this work. So just a huge thank you to everyone. And like a lot of you, I wear multiple hats. So I'm here speaking to you mostly in my hat as Civility Commission Manager from the Jo Cox Foundation, but I'm also an academic at the University of Oxford, where I study abuse in politics around the world and what we can do to address it. So I've got a short presentation that I'll just go through that will focus on the recommendations, but I'll also give a bit of background about why we developed the Civility Commission as well. So for those of you who might not know, the Jo Cox Foundation was established in 2016 by Jo's family and friends after she was tragically murdered. And we work in areas that Jo is passionate about, or Jo was passionate about. You might have heard of the group Great Get Together, which is one of our flagship events and part of our Stronger Communities work. And then the Civility Commission is part of our Respectful Politics work. And the Jo Cox Civility Commission advocates for the implementation of recommendations to address the problem of violence, abuse and intimidation of elected representatives on national and local levels across all the nations and regions of the UK. And it's important to say that we work on this issue not really because of the way that Jo died, but because of the values in which she lived. She believed passionately in robust debate, but robust debate done respectfully, and diversity and democracy. So we really keep kind of what Anya was saying a bit about that positive vision. We really have that in everything that we do. And we really believe that there can be a positive political culture, but it's going to take effort in order for us to kind of create that. And so we developed the 28 recommendations in a collaborative process, including with LWN and colleagues from across the political party spectrum, the police, parliament security, local government association. So we developed these 28 recommendations to support a lot of the work that was already ongoing and to suggest kind of even more progress. So the aim of these recommendations is that they are implementable, and we would love to see them be implemented in the months and years to come. And January 2024 was when we launched our report with the recommendations. So we're just about a year on since the recommendations. And I would say that although we obviously would love to see them all implemented, a lot of the recommendations it's not designed to be a kind of checkbox exercise, but a lot of them will necessitate kind of a longer term culture change. And I just want to go through kind of how we're understanding the problem. And of course, none of this will be news to you, but I just want to kind of pull out the kind of key aspects of why this is so important. So the first part of the problem that we found and research more and more confirms is that this has become kind of a normal problem in politics. So often people talk about that getting abuse. Kind of Seema said, like, oh, just like in a day you get abuse from all different aspects, and that is something that we don't think should be normal, but it is something that we need to address. So kind of the problem has been normalized and kind of part of the job, and that's something we want to address. The second kind of aspect of the problem is it takes a range of forms. So from murder all the way to online abuse and kind of everything in between. This quote is one we pull out because it shows the kind of property damage, the kind of racist abuse, and also the kind of threatening of physical violence. So you've got a lot of different range of forms, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. But it's really important that, this isn't just one type of violence or abuse we're trying to address. It is a whole range of forms, and it comes from a whole range of perpetrators, whether that's within people's own political parties, it can be friends and families, it can be people you don't know. So it's quite a complex issue in terms of addressing it. So that's something we need to be aware of when thinking about solutions. It's also something that impacts all levels of government, which, this audience knows very well. And as I said, we worked a lot with the Local Government Association and also the National Association of Local Councils, who've been working on this issue a huge amount. And it's something we want to ensure is addressed at all levels of government. And as we have heard, this problem has group-based inequalities. So women tend to get abused in more sexualized way. Women of color tend to get abused in more racialized, more personalized ways. So it's really important that we keep that kind of gendered and intersectional lens when we're thinking about how we address this issue, because that's where the evidence shows that's a really big part of the problem. The final point I want to make, and I don't think I have to convince this audience, but that this problem has a real kind of impact for democracy. So obviously it affects the people who are elected representatives, their friends and families, their staff, but there is kind of further evidence that's showing that there is this kind of pipeline problem, that the Girl Guiding has done a lot of different research that suggests that girls and young women don't want to go into politics because they see kind of high profile women getting abused. And that is a real detrimental impact that we want to kind of avoid in the future. But just that this is a really important problem, and it does impact our democracy in the UK, but also around the world as well. But of course, there are things we can do about it. So our call to action, 28 recommendations, were split into these 8 themes. I won't go through every single one, but I'm sure you've all read everything in preparation for tonight's event. But I'll go through the kind of key recommendations and kind of where we are in terms of the progress. So the key recommendations we can say that have been adopted, though of course there always will be an ongoing ongoing aspect of these recommendations to ensure that kind of implementation is comprehensive. So one of the really important recommendations that has been implemented is that there will be specialist police support for local councillors, and that has been piloted at the moment in some police forces and will be rolled out across the country. So we were really pleased that that recommendation is being implemented. The police are also implementing more and more training, like they are expanding their already kind of existing training for police to ensure that kind of one of the problems that we heard about, and I'm sure a lot of you have experience with, is it would really depend what type of support you got, who you spoke to at the police. Some were really excellent and some just weren't sure exactly what their role was in supporting elected representatives. And that is something that is being improved, which is really, really positive. In terms of kind of government and the Electoral Commission implementing recommendations, we were pleased last year at the 2024 local and general elections that the costs associated with safety and security were exempt from election spending limits. So that's a really kind of practical recommendation that has been implemented, and the Electoral Commission have expanded their guidance for candidates during the election period. And I should just, while we're on the Electoral Commission, they've recently released their report for the elections last year, and it has a whole section on intimidation and harassment that kind of adds further evidence to the extent of the problem. And they are really keen to keep working with us and others on addressing this issue, particularly in election times. And Parliament has been taking this issue really, really seriously. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, has really improved security of parliamentarians, as of other teams throughout Parliament. And this year's induction was really comprehensive in terms of safety and security, with even more briefings for staff and families, because we know that it's not just the elected representative that faces abuse, but it really impacts the people around them as well. So those are sort of the more really positive recommendations that we can say have been implemented or are kind of being implemented. There's other recommendations that are being implemented in some places. So we have a set of recommendations for local authorities. And again, some local authorities are really proactive, in signposting security and wellbeing resources, doing risk planning around council meetings, passing motions, following on from the LGA's Debate Not Hate Toolkit and NALC Civility and Respect project. But of course, not all councils are doing the same. So that's something we want to kind of keep monitoring and encouraging. And, if you are a councillor or work at a council, and this is something, we'd really like to hear about if you're doing, or how we can kind of support these recommendations to be implemented. In Parliament, we suggest that there should be mandatory training for elected representatives. We know at the moment this isn't possible because of obviously the way MPs are not employees, so they can't be forced to do training and so on. But it's something that we want to keep kind of working with Parliament and others on, because we know that sometimes the training offered is excellent, but it's not always taken up in as comprehensive a way. So that's something that we want to think about, how this can be kind of improved. And we are working with some groups, including kind of advocating with Ofcom that abuse of elected politicians should be considered when implementing the Online Safety Act. And I'm sure people on this call will be kind of really close to this issue. So if you're working on these related issues, would really encourage that kind of this specific abuse towards elected politicians is considered. And something we get asked a lot is, don't elected representatives themselves have a responsibility to not, abuse each other? And of course, that is part of the problem. So we encourage elected representatives to model good behaviour, compassion in politics, which Anya is from the Jo Cox Foundation. We have a civility pledge that you can go and sign up right now to say that you will kind of engage in public life in a civil way. And that is one small but important marker for people to say that they will kind of engage in politics in a respectful way. We also kind of, as I mentioned, in terms of the training, we really encourage elected representatives to take up those safety and security measures that are offered. And something that we, the final point on this slide, but I'll kind of move on because it also links to kind of the next set of recommendations around political literacy, is that we found, and this will not be news to all of you, is that one of kind of the root causes for abuse is a lack of understanding, a lack of trust in what elected representatives do. So one thing we encourage on an individual level is that elected representatives, visit the education institutions, their constituency. Of course, a lot of elected representatives do this already, but it's one way to really encourage this, political literacy. And we're also working with groups to encourage that this be a mandatory part of the curriculum, but also that there should be more public health like awareness campaigns about exactly what elected representatives do. And the kind of one other recommendation for the government that we are ongoing with our advocacy is this kind of more central unit to address abuse. And of course, a lot of that work is already happening with the Defending Democracy Task Force Seema mentioned. And so that's something that we will be continuing to hopefully work with government representatives on. Now, our last set of recommendations is that, to be honest, we haven't had the most take up with is around political parties. And it's great to speak to LWN because you all have a really strong record of changing the Labour Party. And I think now that it's not a general election year, hopefully we'll have more. We already actually have had more engagement with kind of political party leadership and how political parties can, consistently enforce codes of conduct, better screen candidates training, offer legal support, and any kind of suggestions, good practice, ideas around, particularly around political parties, but also anything else would be really welcome. And obviously Kieran is in charge of what we discussed, but just some things I was thinking about was, the best ways to influence political parties. But just if you have any other ideas of some things we've not kind of touched on so far in the commission, because it is really a kind of ongoing, kind of living piece of work, or if you have good examples, good kind of best practice that we can share with others. And of course, if there are any particular challenges and ideas about how to overcome them in terms of implementing these recommendations and working towards that more positive kind of political culture where everybody can robustly debate with respect, we would really appreciate it. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hannah. We'll definitely pick up some of those themes later. I think what I took from your presentation, and please, I think Jane has been populating the chat with some links. I did read all of the recommendations and the report ahead of this evening's call, so I'm well briefed. But there are those themes, those 8 themes that you mentioned, do seem like a really holistic 360 take on the issue, the problem, and therefore finding those practical solutions that will, like you say, help to stop normalizing this. So help people who do experience this to begin with, but actually try that pushback that Anya mentioned, so that this doesn't become kind of accepted and normalized in politics. I'm gonna stick with the problem a bit before we go to those solutions. And for that, then I think I'm going to bring Saj in, because we've heard about the data, the raw data from Hannah, which is super important to contextualize this problem for us. But I think to humanize it, if we can hear from Saj about directly your experiences of abuse or harassment or intimidation, however you want to describe it, when you stood, like you mentioned, to be the parliamentary candidate for Labour at the last election.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kieran. I'll focus on my experiences during the general election, I think, because I'm conscious of time. And before I start, I think I'm really conscious that there are lots of women councillors, representatives on this call. I'm conscious that many of you will have experienced this kind of, the kind of things that I experienced. And I don't for a second think mine was really, really bad. I'm sure that there are all kinds of awful experiences out there, but I'm just sharing what happened to me and kind of the impact that it had on me at the time. And so there were a couple of things. So one of the things was whilst during the general election, whilst I was out canvassing, I had a couple of occasions of in-person threats made to me, which were accompanied by racial slurs, never quite saying in detail what they were going to do, but very hostile and essentially saying you shouldn't be here, we don't allow people like you to come around here, we take care of people like you around here, in a not caring way. But I'm going to focus on some of the social media aspects, because that's what I've been dealing with the police, and have only just in the last couple of weeks had that case closed. And so I think it'd be interesting to share that with you. So this was before the election itself, and I just announced the fact that I was standing for selection. And when I announced that on social media, I was immediately met with a wave of racist and misogynistic abuse, and comments ranged from sort of sexist slurs and demeaning remarks about my gender to explicit racism, questioning my legitimacy as a candidate. And we've all experienced, I'm sure, this kind of abuse online. But I think the thing that shocked me about it was that it suddenly went from me maybe getting 1 or 2 comments to doing this one post and having 100 comments, 3 of them being positive and about 97 of them being this stuff. And I guess, we develop a thick skin, don't we, as politicians and as women in general, but the amount of it and the real kind of hate-filled nature of it really was genuinely quite shocking to be on the receiving end of that. And I and I also mentioned that during the candidacy, I was subjected to threats and intimidation targeting my personal safety, but also the personal safety of some of my female volunteers who were supporting on the campaign. And again, it was racist abuse, misogynistic abuse, and all of that was reported to the police at the time. Who I have to say, the person that I dealt with at the police was particularly helpful and has continued to be extremely helpful and supportive, although they've not been able to move forward with the investigation anymore, but they certainly kept me up to date. And I think it's an operation called Operation Bridger, through which they support people, and it was a swift response and a really helpful response. So obviously during the election we took a my team and I sort of took precautionary measures to ensure all of our safety. We reassessed our participation in public events, opting to withdraw from some open gatherings where we thought that our security might be compromised. And that wasn't just to protect me, it was obviously also to protect the volunteers as well. So just to kind of bring it to now and to update you as to where it's got to. So I've had several conversations with the police over the last 7 or 8 months since the election. And as I said, in the last couple of weeks, I was told we're not going to move further with it, with any of the social media activity. And the reason for that, as I understand it, and it is quite complex, is that essentially they would have to, some of this, first of all, it took a long time to get a response from the social media outlet, which was Twitter, and they are not able to compel them to respond with information. So that was the first thing. And when they did eventually get a response, it was unclear where the abuse was coming from, whether it was from this country or another country. And therefore, that again added to the complications of being able to prosecute and being able to move any further with it. And so I totally understood why they couldn't take it any further. But I guess, you know, ultimately, after a long time discussing that with the police, a lot of resource going into that, they were unfortunately unable to do anything about it, which is a real concern, really, because some of that stuff was really, you know, clearly abusive. They obviously thought it met the threshold, but the difficulty of prosecuting and the lack of agreements between countries meant that that couldn't be done. Just a couple of reflections I'd just like to share, really. I think the first thing that kind of jumped out at me from Hannah's presentation was that the importance of elected representatives modelling good behaviour. And I think if the thing I've learned from this is if I ever saw this happening to another female colleague, whether she was in my party or another party, the first thing as a fellow, you know, even if I'm standing against them, I would want to reach out to them and check in with them, see if they're okay, but also just to perhaps think about talking, you know, publicly about the fact that this is unacceptable and sharing that with the public and having some kind of united front. I'm not sure I've seen examples of that. And I know, Hannah, you're kind of almost calling out for those examples. I've not seen many examples of that in my experience. So it'd be really good to know if it has happened out there. And if it hasn't, then I think we need to be that change. And that's something that I want to kind of hold myself accountable to. And I guess the men that I work with, but also the other women that I work with, and say, well, actually, if you see this happening elsewhere, you need to stand up and say something about it. Another thing I'd like to point out is, you know, all of us are here today to talk about this really important issue, and I'm really grateful to the Labour Women's Network for inviting me to be able to share my experiences on this platform. But none of us got into politics to come here this evening on a Tuesday night to talk about this kind of stuff. You know, we want to be on here talking about how we improve things for people, housing, how we reduce poverty, and all of those are the things that we really want to work on. And I guess the thing that I learned was that actually a lot of my time, energy went into dealing with this other stuff. And I guess that's the whole point of it, isn't it? You know, it takes us out of being able to do the work that we want to do and pulls us into all kinds of other things and having to deal with police investigations and having to sort out safety and having to do all of these other things, which is not what we're here to do. So I just think that's an important point worth reflecting on and thinking about the support that women can get in order to do that, in order to not have to focus on that. And then just again, that cross-party support, and I know it's there in the recommendations, but actually bringing that to life practically. And I think that that's something that we all need to kind of work together on. And very, you know, be really interesting to hear from others if there have been any cases of people coming together and speaking up about this across parties.
Thank you ever so much, Saj. Thank you for your story. Thank you for that reflection about the distraction from the important work that everybody is here to do in politics and public life, and for that very what seemed simple but quite powerful call to action that we can all do in terms of when we see it, we call it out. In the school that I lead, we encourage our girls to be upstanders, and we mean that in all aspects, so that you stand for what is right and ultimately create the culture that is better for everybody. So thank you, really enjoyed listening to your contributions. I'm going to go to Anya and then Seema, and I do want to bring in other members on the call as well. So Anya, can I ask for your top reflection, please, on what you've heard so far, and maybe then if you have got a call to action for us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to start with reflection of what we've just heard there now. You know, the impact of not being able to be fully present and fully yourself and give all of the obvious talents that you have isn't just on yourself, it's on us all. If you are diminished, politics is diminished. And so that's why this conversation is so important. We cannot have people like you, Saj, whose voices are being restricted. We need your voice. And the more that that's being squashed and held back, the negative impact is on us all. So it's really important that we look at this collectively. I've got just a few thoughts, and weirdly, they all started with C. So obviously I've got my preacher hat on, but my first thought was that the word civility sometimes is really diminished in and of itself. Civility is often seen as a bit of an insipid, nice, it's about being polite and you know, it's a good thing to do, but it's weakened, isn't it? But actually, the word civility and the word compassion are really strong, dynamic, powerful tools that we should be using. And I think we need to reclaim it. So that's my sort of first thought, is that civility is not about an optional extra. It's about civil society. It's about what kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to be the society of quick sound bites from the far right, or do we want to be one of robust debate, as Jo stood for, Jo Cox herself stood for? So I want us to try, that would be my first call to action, I guess, is to try and reclaim the word civility and take it back for ourselves and see it as the dynamic, inspiring word that it can be. Secondly, it's to challenge the norm. Please, let's stop accepting that Saj's story has to be the way that we see women in politics, women of colour in politics, accepting. We have to draw a line in the sand as of now, more than ever, and say that we do not accept that. I can't tell you the amount of times I've tried to speak to a colleague and say, do you know, I was really upset when that guy started trying to film me or intimidate me or harass me. And the pushback was, well, you just need to toughen up. Yes, there's a sense that I probably do need to toughen up and I need to, you know, get more robust as a politician, but I don't accept that that's what we all have to do. We don't have to accept this level of abuse and intimidation, and that this is a sliding slope, you know, and that this is where we're heading. I really want us to collectively draw a line in the sand as of now. So civility, we challenge the word, we challenge what's happening in politics. We look for a collective response. So that's about joining with our sisters here tonight, with Fabians, with Compassion in Politics, and doing this together. We don't have to be isolated in this response. And it's really easy when you look at one of Trump's speeches, sorry to mention he who should not be named, but when we listen to one of his speeches to feel so despairing, but we're not despairing if we act collectively. So that's the next point. And then finally, care. Self-care and care for others. So it's been mentioned about reaching out to people no matter what their political background. If we see intimidation happening, we stand up against that. But care is also about ourselves. And if we want to be in this for the long haul, we have to proactively practice self-care, self-compassion. It's absolutely vital. We cannot go under in this season of Trump and Farage and the far right rising. We have to look after ourselves collectively and as individuals, so that we can stay in for the long haul and we can really work together on a civil society. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you ever so much, Anya, and the power of C is definitely staying with me there. So yes, of course, we've got that compassion and care and collective action, and drawing it back to the idea of civility, which you rightly challenge us to think isn't a soft and fluffy and insipid and polite thing. It's actually thoroughly hard sometimes to be decent and civil with people who perhaps aren't demonstrating those qualities. I'm sure Seema Malhotra may have had some experiences herself in terms of really having to dig deep and be civil in a climate where perhaps that's not replicated. So Seema, I just want to bring you in specifically some of your reflections, but you did mention in your opening comments about the Defending Democracy Task Force, which seems like a cross-governmental agency, cross-governmental work to coordinate government's response to the challenge of what this intimidation and abuse is doing to the very core of democracy. So I definitely want you to speak more about that and where you see real power and force behind that.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and I will also just say, listening to Anya and also others on the call, how proud I am there's so many Fabian women on the call. It's 20 years since I founded the Fabian Women's Network, and just a huge source of pride to me too. Look, I do want to reflect on the work that we're doing in government, but I'll just maybe share just a couple of my own experiences as well, because I do recognise that the last two elections have been more hostile than previous elections, to the extent that you change your behaviour, and you have to change your behaviour, the rules by which you engage even in your own constituency and community, and you do that for your safety and for your staff safety. And this is, there was the 2019 election was a bit more of the, the Brexit sort of moment, but there was hostility that was, had sort of been unleashed in that debate, because if I can bring in another C, we'd forgotten how to have good conversation with boundaries, with rules, and with understanding about how to have debate and conversation. And I do feel that that's got even worse, where actually understanding how to be respectful of others, how to put your point of view across, does not have to be in an aggressive and intimidating way. And the role models that people, younger people particularly, have been looking to are those who really are looking at aggressive ways of having your, of saying what you think, and sort of challenging the rules by, the sort of soft rules by which we've sort of had the most recent period in our history of civility in politics and debate. And in the election, I did have an incident, and it was the one that was probably the most sort of intimidating, and it was an example of, when someone's coming up to you on the street. I don't need to go into all the details, but kind of intimidating, and a phone being stuck in your face, and trying to record what you're saying, and those sorts of things. But when I've been in some of those situations, and particularly with women or young people who have come new into politics, it's really, really difficult, because in a sense we're experiencing that on the back of having had better times in politics, in the sense of, times are always tough, but more civil times in politics, in which we can have a perspective that says this is not normal, and we don't have to put up with this, and we can change it. But when you're coming in new, and particularly if you're bringing in women into politics, or those that are wanting and genuinely interested in debate, the kind of young people, like I was talking to a deputy mayor of London who had come to see Sadiq and then had a tweet, was so excited, but then were utterly shocked by the hostility that came back to them in a sort of engaging in a really innocent and positive way. And I think we need to come back to that power of a good conversation, and actually the rules of that. And Kieran, you'll know what you've been doing in your school, but I certainly have had conversations with my head teachers about this when we've had really divisive issues in politics over the last 3 or 4 years, about how they've handled it to stop polarization with children who maybe will be from different backgrounds and different religions, who, whilst we can talk about debates as foreign policy matters, for children in our schools, when we were in diverse areas, they can actually be issues affecting their family in whichever country there might be a dispute or a conflict going on. So it's more of a, it's personal, it's more personal, and our debates aren't about somewhere far away. For Britain, this is such a diverse nation. Those will feel very, very close to home, and how you have those conversations and conduct them, particularly in schools, are about also giving young people the tools to be able to talk to each other without hostility and without fear. And I see that reflected in schools that have been able to do that more successfully, and how young people have been able to talk to me. And where that hasn't happened, that I feel I walk into a room of hostility with 16-year-olds, which I find sometimes really daunting. And a checkpoint that they'll be leaving school in a year or two, and how will they have the tools to cope in the future? So for our democracy, I think it's really important that we've got these tools, but we're also looking at how we safeguard those frameworks and institutions. And the work of the Defending Democracy Task Force is ongoing, led by Dan Jarvis, but we all input into it. And it is about making sure we're listening to what is going on across the country, listening to where there's intimidation, looking at where, what's contributed to that, and where does there need to be greater intervention to deal with things when they happen, but also then to be preventing that through what mechanisms there might be. And I think that's the other really important bit of this, because it is about safeguarding our democracy for the future. Because if we don't put some of those boundaries in and the tools in to make it, to encourage safe spaces, but B, the tools to operate differently, to operate with respect, but also to know what to do when you see something going, in a sense, going wrong in whatever circumstance that might be, or unacceptable behaviour, that you have a sense of empowerment about what to do, whether it is to intervene, or it is to call the police, or it is to do something else that can intervene early. And I do feel that making sure that we've got that confidence, even to be challenging, as I know, people are challenging now about some of the behaviours in the chamber, and so on, because that is a culture setter as well, in the chamber and in the Commons, that we started to do so collectively. And I'll just finish by saying this. I think there have been different sort of moments and different ways in which we've come together cross-party. I don't see it as much at the moment, but I do think that we need to try and find the space in which we do. But there was for a while a more united campaign that was, in that sort of post-Brexit period particularly. And it was mainly women, but not exclusively, from across the parties in Parliament. And it was important, still got the badge, but it was important because it was about making a statement, and it was about a set of values, and it was about us standing together. And that's where I think the Civility Commission and the work that's going on, and the involvement of LWN and other networks can really start to move again in that space.
Thank you ever so much, Seema, not least for adding another C to this evening's agenda. But I think that conversation word is incredibly important, because when we converse, we listen more than talk. We're listening to understand rather than perhaps listening to respond, listening to shut down, and sometimes that's where healthy debate in our democracy has potentially crossed over into something unhealthy for the rest of us. So those are all been excellent contributions from our panelists this evening. Thank you for the information, for the insights, and for the inspiration to challenge us to do more. We did hear from Hannah at the start, an invitation from others on the call to perhaps share examples of best practice, to consider what political parties might want to do. I noted that that was kind of lower down on your recommendations, Hannah, in terms of things that have been actioned, and we are all here as Labour Party members, so we might want to consider what we can do in that space as well. But if we try to shift our contributions now to a solutions space, I think that will be a very uplifting way to kind of bring tonight's event to a close. We have about 15 or so minutes, 15 to 20 minutes to take contributions. So what I'm going to ask at this stage, I've had Sital, who I know has been checking the chat to see if any questions have come through that way. But I also can bring in sisters by indication of your hand or your virtual hand or a signal in any way. And Sian's going to look out for you. And we'll take questions probably in groups of 3 because we want to get and hear as many ideas and contributions as possible. So is that enough time of me waffling on to be able to bring any sisters to the fore? Sian, do we have anybody who's indicating who they want to contribute at this stage? Sital, did we have anything in the chat?
Yes, so thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you to the panel as well. And there is something that's coming from Sheila Keenan, which is saying that they also need to be conversations with male Labour Party members. So how can we set about this?
Okay, thank you, Sheila. And that probably speaks to the idea of politicians modelling positive behaviours too. That as a party, we can't be immune, and we need to hold the mirror up to ourselves at times as well, to ensure that the business of politics internally is as civil as we expect it to be externally. I'm getting a sense that that's at the root of that question. Is there anybody from the panel who would like to take that? Anya, I can see your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would absolutely agree with that and say if we want to keep a Labour government and if we want to stay in power so that we can do good stuff for our society, and if we want to defend democracy, then we have to make sure that we are a representative party. We have to make sure that we have enough women, enough people of colour, enough people from the LGBT community, etc., etc. There's no point just being, you know, one size fits all politician if we want to represent this nation. So it's wider than just doing the right thing and being nice to people and getting more women on board. This is about safeguarding democracy, and it's about Labour having a really good shot at being able to change this nation and do good things. So I think that's why we need male allies, because there's no point us just trying to do it in our own strength. It needs to be a collective response and for the good of all. So I think that's almost the selling point for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and completely agree with that, and just to say that, you know, if we're saying that as a result of this kind of intimidation that women's place in politics is diminished, then that means democracy overall is diminished, and that's a problem for everybody. And so absolutely we need to reach out to men in our movement, and we need them to be a part of the solution, to really understand the impact that this can have on women, and ask them, well, how can they support the women in their Labour groups across the country, or not just in their Labour groups, women in politics in general, and how can we make it so that, you know, young people or even, you know, any woman who comes into politics and sees this immediately isn't automatically put off continuing in politics, because actually this is potentially, it's too much hostility towards her or potentially to her family. And so, yeah, absolutely agree that we need men's voices and action from men on this agenda too.
Thank you. I might ask actually, just in terms of some of those practicalities of all of the panel who are women in public life, and the need, you know, for self-care, your sisterly support, your support networks. Would anybody mind sharing what they have done practically, what they do, who they go to ensure that you keep that strength, you keep that flame alive and burning, so you can do all that good work that Anya mentioned in terms of a more socially just society.
Is that just to the panel, Kieran, or to
anybody who wants to share, really?
Okay, I'll go back on mute then and let others speak.
I'm scanning through and can't see, which is fine, but I would encourage members on the call to share.
I will just say, while we're waiting for somebody else to speak, that I think spaces like this are just so invaluable. So I'm a graduate of the Jo Cox Women in Leadership programme. We have a WhatsApp group, and that is just the most amazing place to be able to go to. So many women who understand. And so the fact that we've got a network like this that's allowed us to create those kinds of spaces is a huge boon and a huge help in those kinds of situations. And we shouldn't ever, underestimate the value of something like that.
Thank you. Another plug for LWN and our training and our courses in the network. Much appreciated.
Kieran, can I jump
yes,
in?
Catherine, sorry, I can just see
so
you.
Sorry, I can't find how to raise the hand. I'm sure
Please don't apologise. You raise your actual hand, which I much prefer. So, Catherine, for those of you who don't know Catherine, Catherine is LWN's treasurer. And actually, Catherine, why don't you introduce yourself and then?
I'm LWN's treasurer. And I'm also a counsellor in Hounslow. Sorry, I slightly missed what you were asking people to comment on, Kieran, because I was searching for the LGA motion that someone else has posted now in the chat.
It's very practical
ways.
I do sometimes have an issue with self-care, but I'll use it because I think it's something that people understand. But what do you do essentially to just keep being you, keep soldiering on?
I mean, my comment was going to be more around sort of supporting other women, which I think is an important part of self-care, because it's about those networks that we form and we support other women and then they support us back again. And so we've got a wonderful fairly informal women's group in our CLP at the moment, and we also have an informal women counsellors group, and great to see another member of that group on the call. And I just tried to share resources, so I shared about the meeting tonight, but also to give support to each other when we see that bad things are happening. I mean, we've got a particularly nasty by-election campaign in our borough at the moment. So it's just about reassuring the candidate and the other women that we're there for them as well, because I don't think you can underestimate the value of that kind of support, and just, sending a word to people to say, look, if you want to talk, I'm here. I know what you're going through. And obviously it shouldn't have to be like that, and we need to tackle all the other things as well to stop it from happening. But if we accept it is happening at the moment, then I think providing that mutual support for each other is really, really important.
Thank you. I can see Rachel and Anya's hand as well. So we've got Rachel Saunders. Can I invite you in, Rachel?
Thank you, Kieran. And I was just going to say something in response to your kind of how do you stay you question. And it was something that I started to develop actually when I first ever stood for election, because I found the transition from being an activist to being, so I was a councillor for 10 years. I found that transition really weird when it's kind of your face on the leaflet. So, and it helped a lot when it came to dealing with kind of abuse and unpleasantness as well, which is I kind of had a mental image of a kind of a public persona me, and it's not really me, but there's a kind of there's a public persona which has obviously is a reflection of me and has some elements of me in it, and people can get to know the public persona, but they don't actually know me. And when they're kind of throwing brickbats or abuse or saying horrible things, because they don't really know me, they've just met this kind of public persona. It's not really something that I need to take at all personally. And the kind of the leaflet, Rachel, can be kind of, can stay outside the front door when I get home, and I kind of move on and get on with my life and put that persona back on again when I need to. And I hope that sounds less mad than maybe it feels as I describe it, but I think it's sometimes helpful to kind of to remember that however much kind of that persona might be getting trashed or abused or whatever it is, that you're still you, and those people actually know very little about you and your contribution and your value, and it's whatever happens to that persona, you still have the value and the contribution that you ever have had.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that's super helpful sometimes, that actually having that split persona, not split personality, but being able to be objective and remove yourself from what will be a hyperly personalized experience is perhaps a protective factor in that. Thank you. Before I bring in others, I know Seema she's given us a lot of time this evening, and I know she's got something else that she'll need to move on to. So I didn't want her just disappearing from the call. So Seema, before you go, thank you ever so much for listening in, for sharing your story, and your continued commitment to this topic. We know that we have a friend and ally in you, and I'm sure you will be championing this cause from the very heart of government. So thank you very much, Seema.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Okay, so we do have, however, 5 to 10 more minutes with the rest of us, so that's exciting. I can still see Anya's hand, and I think Sital. Oh, I've got Selena as well. So I'm going to go to Sital just in case that was bringing in contributions from the chat that I missed, and then I'll see where we are after that. So Sital.
Thank you, Kieran. Just to say that there is the motion. Thank you for putting up the motion to council. But if there are any ideas about motions, code of conduct, does that need reviewing because of the way that oppositions are treated with each other and facing kind of opposition backlash? And then there's the other thing about actually when somebody is called out and there is the dealing with what happens afterwards and the consequences of what happens afterwards. And I think there is something else in this space which is about that internal and external. So it's not just from the public but it's also from your colleagues, and having to have it both ways as well, and dealing with that. And just on a personal level, I wanted to ask whether what the panel thought about some kind of DEI training for labour groups, as something, as a way of trying to think about civility in public life.
Thank you. Can I just check before I go to the panel, because we can have some closing remarks while that's wrapped up in the panel as well. I did have a member on the call with her hand up, so I think it's Selena, but it does say that you're connecting to audio, so I don't know if you...
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, lovely.
Basically, I just had a question. I understand, like, when people say, oh, you should get a thick skin, and and I understand everything that's like being said tonight, but not to be like radical, but do you think that there's a space sometimes for people just to retreat and only just do the basics on social media and not be too involved in social media? Because obviously politicians have been around for a long time and social media hasn't been around as long, and I just wonder, like, I'm just not really attracted to putting myself in the lion's den on a daily basis. And I was just wondering, like, I know some spaces are more hostile than others, and I found it really interesting watching Molly May's like documentary of how she deals with like different spaces. Like YouTube is just like a really supportive space, and then like Instagram is not as supportive as, and it just seemed like, is social media like overrated, and is it even really necessary to be so engaged in it and putting yourself in harm's way? Because like one comment can kind of like ruin your morning for some people, so I was just wondering.
Yeah, and I think actually I mean, we like radical here. There's no need to minimize the being radical, but that seems like quite a pragmatic approach and a question to be asking. Of do politics, and what's the relationship between politicians and social media? And if it's an unhealthy one, should we seek to remove ourselves from that space? Is what I think I was hearing from you. As somebody who's very late to the game on social media, I'm the wrong person to talk to. It took me about 12 years to set up my Twitter X account. So I will go to other members of the panel who might have an instinctive response to what do we do in terms of being a person in public life and the need to have a social media account and profile. Anya, did you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really, really good question. And I think it's one a lot of people are grappling with. So it's not that quirky a question to be asking, honestly. I see different people doing different things with this. Some are very engaged and post a lot on a wide variety of platforms, and some are really, really scaling it in now. And I think there's a bit of a move to that. I think it's what you're comfortable with. So for me personally, I've totally come off X because for me, it just become unpleasant. And I was feeling every time I went on it, just myself coming down. And so what's the point of that? But I've stayed on it in terms of the counsellor X because a lot of our residents are still using it. So we will stay on there so that we can post social events and that kind of thing. But me personally, and talking about anything that I believe or things that I've done, I've come off it because it was just too costly. I really don't think there's a one size fits all, but listen to that gut feeling that you've got. And if you're feeling uncomfortable and if you're getting too much hate and criticism, what is the point? It's a tool, it's not the only tool. So just be really mindful of yourself with it, I think.
Thank you very much. We are coming close to drawing the evening to a close, but I did notice from the chat, and apologies if I mispronounce your name, is it Corinna or Karina who wanted to emphasise the point?
Hi. Yes, ex-councillor of London Borough of Hounslow, and I have huge respect for obviously Seema. I've known her a long, long time, but also to Catherine Dunn, who I'm afraid, has suffered a huge amount of abuse just for standing up for women and just being herself, I presume. But one of the things I think is really important, and Farah, who's one of the councillors in Hounslow, emphasised in chat, but I'd just like to re-emphasise it, is our male colleagues in the Labour Party have got a responsibility to be supportive of the women. Now, if they're the ones who have got it, get it, understand misogyny, etc., they really have got to step up and be talking to the other men, because unfortunately, as we all recognise as women, if a man says something, it has so much more effect on the other men. But I'm not taking anything away from us as supportive women being together as being collectively supportive, and LWN has been brilliant about that, and there are other women's organisations within the Labour Party that do exactly the same thing. However, I do think we do have to recognise limitations, and I absolutely agree with you, and I think that was an excellent summary there. If you're in the kitchen and it's too hot, excuse me, you get out of the kitchen for a while, take a breath. You absolutely must take care of yourself, because you cannot be a politician for others and be effective if you are suffering. So I think we just have to take that as a bit. Sorry, I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Not at all. And I think there is some real honest sharing this evening, and that's part of tackling the problem, is understanding it to begin with. We aren't going to shy away from the fact that absolutely, I've heard a lot, and I've just quickly glanced at the chat, that you know, we can come to these spaces and we can feel inspired and we can feel a sense of collective action, and then we can go back to our CLPs or our labour groups and think, what on earth is going on? This is not who we're about. And I think at LWN we are serious in trying to change the culture of the Labour Party, to improve it for all, to make it an inclusive space. So we will work closely, we have done, and we continue to do so with the Jo Cox Foundation on the Civility Commission, its recommendations, its challenge to political parties, and to see what we can do internally with this report to bring about that culture change that we all desperately want, deserve, and quite frankly should be the status quo in a civilized democracy, which we purport to be. Okay, well, thank you again. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for those of you who've given a big chunk of your Tuesday evening to be with us. There is, if this was just a snippet of what is possible, please do check the links. I think an email will be sent out with further information if you are interested in terms of knowing more about the Civility Commission's report, if you're in local council groups, what you can do there, what we can do within the party as well. This is not the end, because we've had a meeting, unfortunately, and some good PowerPoint slides on the issue itself. We know this is only the start, and it will take the kind of collective action from all of us to make that change. So please do look at the report, sign up to the Civility Pledge if you're in public life yourself. Join LWN if you are not yet a member. Why you are not, I would not know, but please do consider joining us. Take a look at the website or our social media feeds for future and upcoming events. I'm not sure if they have been put in the chat, but they have. I've been vigorous nods. So have a look at the chat, please, as well, because it will be wonderful for you to join us again sometime in the future. So thank you, sisters. It's been wonderful. I've enjoyed myself. I feel uplifted. I've got my 5 C's. I'm ready to go. So hopefully you are too. Thank you very much. Good evening.